So the Neuvilette and Zhongli banner have just dropped. Two very good but different units, so I wanted to talk a bit about the banners, if you should summon, who you should summon, and why. Regarding the 4 stars, we do have Fischl there, which is considered to be one of the best supports. Yao Yao is also pretty good at higher constellations, and Hazo, well, he's a pure DPS. I do like him and think he's fun, but I personally wouldn't summon on the banner specifically for him. Firstly, should you summon? The short answer is no. While I usually wouldn't talk about potential future characters, I think it's quite relevant right now, especially regarding the Pyro Archon, which should be coming up soon. And if we're going to trust history, she's going to be a game-breaking support, because ever since the first Archon Venti, they've arguably only gotten stronger with every new region. Venti himself has fallen a bit out of the meta by now, but if AoE content ever makes a meaningful comeback, so will Venti. Zhongli isn't used as much anymore these days either, but still has place in a lot of teams for his universal res shred and insanely strong shield, and the interruption resistance that goes along with that shield. Then we had Raiden Shogun, which you could argue is more of a DPS than a support, but I'd say she can be played either or. Due to her incredibly long-lasting off-field electro, she can, for example, be used as a hyper bloom trigger. You could build her like a burst DPS, or even somewhere in the middle, like in a quick bloom team, where she's triggering not only hyper bloom, but aggravate. Then we have Nahida, basically a shoo-in for any Dendro reaction-focused teams. Also has very long-lasting off-field Dendro application and a lot of it. And most recently, Furina. Do I need to even say anything about her? One thing most Archons have in common is that they're very flexible, meaning they can be used in a lot of different teams. Furina drives this point home the most obviously. She's best in slot for almost every team, and that's not even mentioning her insane off-field DPS capabilities. So that's all just to say, whether you like her motorcycle or not, there is a very high chance she's going to be an incredible unit. While I'm not sure it's officially known when she's going to be released, I'm assuming it's next patch, if not the patch after. Obviously, if it's the next patch, we'll have plenty of official information about her before these banners are even gone. So regardless, I would at least wait for that. If after some relevant details are released and she turns out that, don't like her, feels too niche, or whatever. Still though, people pull units for different reasons, so I'm not saying it's a mistake to go for one of these if you just like them as characters. Neuvillette, obviously one of the most busted DPSs. In general, I would say he's obviously worth to pull, but also I don't value main DPSs as much as supports. It might be a little biased because I have everyone, but at the end of the day, most teams have just one main DPS and 3 supports, so you just objectively need less DPSs. Also, most quote-unquote bad DPSs become good with good supports and vice versa. So with the consider saving your primos argument out of the way, I do want to talk about these 2 units separately because again, they are very different. And who you should pick up really depends on your current state of the game. Let's just start with some quick pros and cons for Neuvillette. First, of course, big damage. And not only big damage, but big single target and AoE damage because his beam pierces enemies. His beam is also quite long, so you can hit enemies from a distance. He's also a very self-sufficient character. He does consume his own HP, but also heals himself, so you don't necessarily need some specific unit like a healer in your team when you're running Neuvillette. And he's a very solid solo character. I would imagine most people don't really care about that because it is a team game, but it also means his team options are a little more open than others. I would say most of Neuvillette's cons are fixed with investment, unfortunately. At C0, he can be interrupted by enemy attacks, and that's very annoying. After getting used to my C1 plus Neuvillette, I played with a C0 Neuvillette, and it wasn't very comfortable. You can, of course, get around this by having Zhongli, which isn't a horrible teammate for him anyway. I've heard, though I can't test this myself, that Zealinen's resistance to interruption is actually enough for C0 Neuvillette, and he at least won't be getting knocked around all the time, but that is also C1 Zealinen. So you don't necessarily need a shield, but it does make him a lot more comfortable at C0. And the other main con is that the free-to-play weapons available aren't that good for him. Sacrificial Jade is great, but it comes from the battle pass, so if you don't have like a decent 5-star crit damage book for him, then yeah, his damage will suffer quite a bit. His best teams are a bit more limited at C0 as well, because you need that extra reaction in there. So while he can be a good DPS at C0 R0, it's my personal opinion that he doesn't become really good until C1 R1. And finally, something that's not really a pro or a con, it's more personal preference, but he's a very simple character to play. To be totally honest, it's one reason I like him. You just set up a couple buffs and then boom, probably more so because of the beam attack. I just love beam attacks for whatever reason. I said this since I first saw him in the special program for version 4 point whatever, I forgot. If you can invest a bit into Neuvillette, should you try and get his weapon or C1? Unfortunately, again, that depends. If you'd have to spend actual money for it, I would just buy the battle pass 5 times and get R5 Sacrificial Jade. Obviously takes a little longer, but it's better value. Besides that, it's still a little hard to quantify depending on which weapon you would upgrade from. Coming from his one decent, truly free-to-play weapon, the prototype Amber, yeah, it's a massive upgrade. If you have the event weapon, Ash Graven, it's a little better than prototype, so less big, C1, not only for the interruption resistance, but it can potentially increase your damage as well, because you keep the damage stack, which is a huge part of his damage, and allows you to take one less unit specifically for the reaction to fully max his passive here. Me personally, I value C1 over R1 because I put a lot of value on the second part, not getting knocked around. It makes me mad and I don't want to be forced to take Zhongli in every team. Besides that, you can only get C1 when Neuvillette is here. Same is the case for his signature, but there are other solid options for him and might be in the future. But yeah, if Prototype Amber was the best weapon I had for him, then I would definitely consider his signature. Of course, there is a ton of nuance, like even at C0, there are teams that make it worth it to mostly ignore the passive. Like a point blank statement, if you have Furina, she'll make up for it. Not only because of everything Furina does, but it's also Hydra Resonance giving him extra HP. And then it's like, when you're already giving up this 35% damage here, what's another 15%? Like this team, for example, you're only gonna get one stack. But at C0, it's probably close to the team I would take with Neuvillette, ignoring the fact Arzeon is C2 and might give us enough interruption resistance without Zhongli. Mix a few units around and you can also vaporize with Neuvillette. Honestly, not something I've really explored that much, just because I like my good old hyper carry. Could throw Imli in there for more like a burn vape sort of deal. But yeah, I mean, his team options are pretty flexible even at C0, just not so much if you really want to max his passive as well. The recent addition to the game, Auroron, can be a pretty interesting support for Neuvillette as well. A big reason of that being Cinder City. Res Shred from like Viridescent will almost always be more powerful, but this also does last twice as long and Neuvillette can need a good amount of on-field time. The taunt from his burst can be situationally useful as well, especially if your Neuvillette is C0, it can keep them away from him, or even get the enemies a little closer together so he can hit them all at once. And of course, being an Electro helps with his passive. Could also try the good old Archon team. This is what I tried when he first came out, and it works surprisingly well. All these guys have very long-lasting buffs, so it's a very simple team as well, and you do max his passive. When you start talking about every other unit in the game, and if you should pull for them instead, it gets a lot more messy. Again, personally, I value supports over DPSs, so yeah, I would say in a general sense, he's not the most valuable character to pull for. Again, as a blanket statement, I would go for Furina or Zealonin over Neuvillette first if you don't have them. Moving on to Zhongli, let's just talk about the pros and cons. Obviously, the biggest pro is his shield. It's incredibly strong, nearly indestructible. It's very useful for certain units, mostly bow users, not specifically if you're bad at dodging, but also outside of bow users, there are times you just don't want to interrupt, like a normal attack chain, for example, to dash and iframe out of the way of an attack. Zhongli's shield allows you to just tank the attack and continue on attacking. His 20% res shred is weaker than most other forms of res shred. Deepwood, Zealonin, Viridescent, Superconduct, and while those sources do cover the entire spectrum of elements, there's often multiple types of damage happening in every team, and especially with something like Viridescent, it's hard to get more than one. In double Hydro Vaporized teams, for example, sure, it's more important to reduce the Pyro res, but it's nice to also reduce the Hydro res. Also, it should be noted that unlike some types of res shred where it applies to the enemy, Zhongli's res shred is like an aura around himself, so you don't need to separately apply it to every enemy. I'm not going to say it's a better res shred than like Viridescent, but it's way easier and is there as long as he has a shield, so it's very consistent. Finally, the last real pro I can think of is that he is incredibly flexible. You can throw Zhongli in almost any team and he's going to be like an upgrade to that team. These days, I'm not sure he's like objectively best in meta teams, but he's still a good pick in a ton of teams. Oh yeah, one more. He is very free-to-play friendly as well. He does not need constellations, and you definitely do not even want his signature weapon. Just give him Favonius, or hell, even Black Tassel with his HP percent. One of the cons, which might not be a real con, but something that happened to me in particular, because I was using Zhongli a lot, and I got really bad at dodging because I never needed to. It basically got to the point where my community forced me to not use Zhongli for a month, and honestly, since then, I really haven't used him that much. He is a very nice comfort character if you just want to chill and not really worry about anything, but I guess you do kind of have to be aware that if you play with him in every team, then you're probably going to get pretty bad at dodging. Besides that, again, by now, we do have some incredible supports that bring more to the table than Zhongli does. The only exception is if you or the team really needs his shield, like with the previous DPSs that really don't want their normal attack chain interrupted. Also, yeah, I guess his burst is basically not worth doing until C2, because at C2 you get the shield you would get by holding E, but yeah, it has a long animation, so the damage and the short stun to enemies is almost never worth doing. Just the general lack of damage in Zhongli's kit as a whole, which in my opinion isn't the most important thing to focus on when you're talking about a support. We do have units like Furina these days that can not only buff to high hell, but also do a lot of sub DPS. But yeah, that's pretty much all I can say about Zhongli. Like, you really should know if you want or need him for your team before summoning, so if you're questioning it, just don't summon for him. But yeah, I guess that pretty much sums it up. Again, I would personally wait to hear more about Mavuika. But if you're dead set on pulling on this banner right now, I don't know. It still depends. I have a hard time giving blanket statements, especially considering they're two very different units, but I do feel like Neuvillette has more overall value than Zhongli. Feel free to share your own thoughts in the comments down below though. Leaving a like or subscribing to the channel if you enjoy is always greatly appreciated as well. Thanks, as always, for watching, and until next time.